Hispanic friends. Everybody in my world was of Western European extraction. No one spoke with an accent because immigration had been cut off in the 20s or the 30s, so there had not been that element. Now, when I was a junior in high school was when the busing, the school integration began. And now for the first...
Desegregation.
What did I say?
Integration. Desegregation.
Desegregation?
Yeah.
Okay.
Totally different.
Okay. So that's when we started having African American students coming to our high school. Well, I became friends with several of those students, mostly guys with whom I played football or basketball, ran track. And we had an athletic bus that would take the athletes home after practice. And for most of us, we'd be home in 10 or 15 minutes. But for the African American students, it was way on the other side of town. So it happened that my brother and I had a car, and so I had offered to take some of my buddies home. And it was my first time into that part of town. Because we could go downtown, and we didn't have to go through the black part of town. Well, when I entered that, all of a sudden I become responsible for a new reality. It's like, wow, these kids have got a very different experience, and I can see why they resent being at our school. So now I in a sense, my world, maybe it wasn't great, but from the perspective of the person who's experiencing this world, it seemed pretty nice. But I realized there's an America that exists that I know nothing of. Now, as a follower of Christ, I have to wrestle with that. I could choose to block it out and say it's easier not to deal with it, but to say this is part of the world for which Christ died. This is the world that God loves. These are people who are made in the image of God. Why do they do that? Well, ask them. And I think that having been involved in racial reconciliation these last 2 years, very intentionally after Charleston, and hearing the stories of young black men whose worlds were completely different from my idyllic world, now I have a responsibility to that, and to realize that generosity is at the heart of God. Sharing. So the things that I have, I realize I didn't do anything to deserve this. It was given to me. I have to steward it. And I think these are the areas where, even for people who think about making America great again, it's a matter of we are part of a global family. So there is, I'm not saying that America was great, but it's the conditioning. It looked pretty good to me. And so I think there are certain people who've romanticized a period of time where schools were good, communities were safe, families were united. It was a different kind of an experience, and most people our generation, of this generation, my children's generation, know nothing about that.
Well,
so, but I would also say, Emmett, that I do not like the language of "Make America Great Again," because America is not a planet or a country on a planet. I don't like the language of "Take America Back." To me, that's very racist language. I would say we have a responsibility to help our country move forward. How do we take America forward?
Yeah. I mean, the great, I always talk about America, it actually uses United States, because I think that actually gives us the notion of the aspiration. That the aspiration was for us to have United States, and we haven't reached that yet, right? And so in that inquiry of what does it mean to have United States, I'm still wrestling where the great piece was, because we haven't gotten there. And the notion that we can claim integration when actually it was desegregation, right? Because those black students were bused into your neighborhood.
Right.
You didn't bust any people from your neighborhood into their neighborhood, right? So there's a
Yeah.
balance of power there that is unequal, so
Sure.
the scales of liberty are a little slanted. And then on the other side of town were young black males and young Latino males and young people of color who were being sent off to the war, right, because of the draft, right? While in this neighborhood, probably no disruption, people had access to go to college and Ivy League experiences, which created a notion for the access for wealth, right? Whereas folks were disrupted in their lives to go fight for the country, right? And don't have access to wealth, which now we can talk about as generational wealth, right? And so in that frame, I'm still trying to figure out how the God that was preached in that neighborhood and how the Christ who was revealed in that neighborhood equates to the same God that was on the other side of the neighborhood and the Christ on the other side of the neighborhood. They don't equate.
Let me jump in here with a little bit of the conservative perspective on those two issues, which I think, by the way, that would be a subject for an entire segment of our conversation alone. Two things have intrigued me that you guys have mentioned. Number one is, has America ever been great? And is America a great nation? And are we talking realistically about returning to that greatness? Number one, or is that just a smokescreen for something else? And number two, again, the deep concern for the downtrodden, for the powerless, for the voiceless, for the poor, and how do we approach that in a way that is equitable, balanced, nuanced from a biblical perspective, and not turn minorities and ethnic groups into kind of and look at them in a paternalistic sort of way, sucking out from them their sense of responsibility and agency, and their their right to be critiqued as well, and to be pushed, to get some pushback as well for their own responsibility, our own responsibility, to push ourselves forward. I think these two issues that need to be really massaged and worked through. And the issue but let me just take one of them, which is the issue of the greatness of America. Maybe we can just stay on this for a little while before we finish. Okay, I mean, what do we mean? What do we mean? What I would ask, number one, is what do we mean by great? Do we mean great in an absolute sense of the word? Great in the sense of perfection and having achieved a level of excellence and moral solidity that is unquestionable? Or do we mean great in the sense of a historical comparison of other kingdoms and other nations and other powers that have journeyed through history? The Roman Empire, the English Empire, the Greeks, or whatever it is, the colonial powers that colonized Africa and the Middle East and the East and so on and so forth. I mean, when I look at America, and again, I'm looking at it from the perspective of an immigrant and of a pastor who pastors immigrants. My admiration for America really is extraordinary. It's huge. It's huge. I could be a white guy talking from, Nashville, Tennessee, really talking about America. I love America. I think it's an extraordinary nation. I think it has been so for many centuries. I think its influence has been more benign than many other powers, that have inhabited history. I just saw a movie. By the way, I'd love to get your perspective sometime about silence.
Okay.
Having been a missionary. I read that book 30 years ago, and it's a fascinating book, and the movie is really interesting as well. But I love movies, and they express some things. I just saw a movie about a woman whose name I won't even try to remember right now. Just recently, there's a scene in the movie because she was an English woman who went to Tehran and who explored the Middle East and became very influential, in the Middle East. But there's a moment in the movie where Winston Churchill and a couple of English generals are sitting down discussing how they are going to divide the Middle East for themselves, and they're talking about what does France think, and what does Germany think. The Arabs are just pawns.
Sure.
And yet their whole world is being divided in a small table is being decided, and they're drawing like little kids' crayons. Or the borders of these different, which of course explains all the headaches that we're suffering right now in the Middle East. As we divided things,
all these nations,
arbitrarily for our own
together,
benefits. And the arrogance and the exploitation and just the sheer unilateral nature of how these empires related to their oppressed subjects. When I look at America, I see something a little more complex than that. I do see self-interest, of course. I do see what Americans did, in Latin America, putting dictators in power because, it served American interests, and seeing Latin America as their backyard and the manifest destiny and all of these different things. And yet, knowing about all of that, knowing about the Mexican-American War and how America just stole, and I think it's a well-known fact, almost half of Mexico's territory, because it was weak, because they just become independent from Spain, and they didn't have the power to defend itself of that large territory that they had for themselves all of a sudden. They stole Texas and California and part of New Mexico and so on. And now the Mexicans who come into those territories that were their own, their ancestral homes, now they're illegal and they're criminals. And yet, that territory was taken away by a criminal act of this nation. I understand all that. I get all that.